Hello and welcome. My name is Rachel Hopkins at RE Hopkins Consulting, and thank you for joining us. We are investigating the intersection of marketing, sustainability, and design. And today I have Sandra Lewis, who is the Director of Sales at Westfall Technic in Scottsdale, Arizona. Welcome, Sandra.
Yeah, thank you. Happy to be here.
Great. Thank you. Would you please tell everybody a little bit about yourself and your journey to get here and what you do and what you've been doing?
Sure. The quick version is, so it started when I was young. I always had this interest in environmentalism and sustainability. I actually grew up inside the Grand Canyon. There's a little tiny village inside Grand Canyon National Park. So my first job was actually with the Park Service when I was 16 years old. And then from there, went to college and got a degree in environmental science. And I expected that I would work for the Park Service my whole life. When you grow up inside a national park, you don't know that there's any other jobs that exist other than park rangers. But in college, with my environmental science degree, as soon as I graduated, I moved to Washington, D.C. and went to the big city and worked for a congressman working on natural resources policy. And that was really interesting and eye-opening. And then, and I skipped a few things. So I did firefighting and trapping raccoons before that. So really,
oh my goodness,
random background between fighting forest fires, trapping raccoons, and then working with politicians. Really prepared me for being a mother today. So
a little bit different, yeah. Many skills. You have many skills.
Yeah, exactly. But then completely changed careers and went into a company called Earth 911 that was focused on recycling data, recycling trends, and it was like a website, kind of a data website company. So really a big shift from the Park Service and working in environmental policy into more like recycling data-driven information. And then from there, again, switched careers and went into recycling with Envision Plastics that sells recycled HDPE. So went into more of the resin and the packaging side with recycled PCR post-consumer resin and selling that. And then a year ago, switched to Westfall Technic.
Oh, wow. That is a great background. Yeah. Well, it's your journey. So I think that's kind of interesting. And, coming from that background. So when you came from, what was it, Earth 911 into industry, what did you think about how industry was making decisions? Was it different than making decisions in, say, the policy area?
Oh, big time. So it was a very eye-opening experience for me, and I had no background or nothing to prepare me for it. And I was there for that 6 years. And even in that 6 years, I saw this major shift in industry. And when I first started, it was very much about cost. And it was about, we want to use PCR, but we don't want to pay 1 penny more for it. And we want it to look exactly like virgin. And then after just in that 6 year time, there was such a huge shift where companies were then willing to come to the table. They knew that there was a premium to using PCR. They understood the economics, but they also, I remember at one point, a customer being disappointed because it looked too good. They're like, it looks too much like virgin. So we had this switch, where people wanted to see that it had recycled content and wanted to be able to tell that story and have the package look like that. So there's a really interesting shift just in that very short time frame from the industry perspective.
And is that because of the data that they got from consumers, or just higher demand or more publicity? What was really driving that change?
Yeah, I think it was a lot of different pressures. I think consumers started demanding it, and that recycling is where the consumer participates. Like, I put my bottle in the recycle bin, so I'm participating in that action. So then when they see that come back in a package, they feel like more trust in the system. Like, oh, when I recycle this, it gets put back in a product that I'm using. So I think they're consumers, there was a lot more acceptance, but also a lot more demand from the consumer side. But then also just the pressures of the world, of seeing our oceans filled up with plastic, companies started saying, we have to do something about this. Like, we have to, do our part and support that circular economy. So I think there was a lot of different pressures and different changes in perspective that happened in a very short time.
That's an interesting perspective. Yeah, I mean, in the consumer packaged goods industry, there's always a demand for, recycled content or packages that are more easily recyclable. But there's always, difficulty and with parts of the package or how it's recycled or where it can be recycled. We have seen that consumers are demanding a lot more. And I wanted to ask you, because I know that Westfall Technic makes a lot of caps and closures. And I know that caps and closures is a really tough place for recycling, and consumers don't know what to do with a cap on their product. How does design come into that and demand come into that industry?
Yeah, so I am going to answer your question, but I'll probably use my little personal journey to get to the answer to it. Back when I was 20 fighting forest fires, I never thought in a million years that closures would become my passion, and my personal mission in life is to better the world one closure at a time. But that's really where I envision my life today, and that's why I'm at Westfall Technic. And how I got here, and it really is through a closure. When I was working for Envision Plastics, we had some major companies wanting to put PCR into closures. And today, most closures are polypropylene. And so talking, recycling real fast, a lot of containers are, for example, HDPE, like think of your laundry detergent, your milk jug, your shampoo bottle, all HDPE, but most of those have a polypropylene closure on them. Soda bottles, so most of the soda bottles are going to be PET, but then they'll have an HD or a polypropylene closure on top of it. So you have this mix of plastics. So specifically to HDPE, because that's where I came from with Envision Plastics, the number one contaminant in the HDPE stream is polypropylene. And that's because of that combination in that package of the bottle being HDPE and the top being polypropylene. And the recommendation for recycling is to keep the cap on. So I don't want anybody to hear me say, oh, you should take the cap off so that we don't have contamination. No, we want to capture the plastic, but we want to capture it as cleanly as possible. And specifically with HDPE and polypropylene, that combination is really tricky because an important step in the recycling process is a float sink process, and that's the way to separate different kinds of plastic. So in this configuration, the PET will sink and the HDPE and the polypropylene will float. And so you're easily able to separate these two plastics. But when the configuration is HDPE and polypropylene, they're not going to be able to separate that way, and they're both going to float and thus be mingled together in the recycling stream. So we were seeing this increase in polypropylene because there happened to be a lot of lightweighting with the container, and to a much lesser degree lightweighting with the closure. So we kept seeing this increase in polypropylene. So back to the question, we had some companies, some major brands come to Envision saying, we want to add post-consumer resin into these closures. And they had us send sample material, all over the place, and a lot of different companies trying to put this post-consumer resin into the closure. And just with not a lot of success. Companies were having a really hard time doing it because it's a different kind of resin, it's different melt flows, just different technical properties. It was really hard to blend it together and get good results. So it was very discouraging for me, where there was these willing companies wanting to do this, and then just on the technical side, not having good luck, not finding the right technical expertise to be able to do that. And near the end of that, this company I'd never heard of before called Westfall Technic came to the plant. I gave them a tour, went through the whole spiel, And they're like, well, we'd like to try to make that with PCR. We're good at making closures. We'd love to try to do that. I'm like, good luck. So I sent them the resin, and they came back to me and they're like, oh, here it is. We made it with 100% PCR.
Really, with
Yeah.
mixed PCR, like with HDPE and polypropylene together?
So this is 100% HDPE, but it does have some, polypropylene contamination in it. But yeah, so this is Envision Plastics HDPE, their post-consumer resin. And I have a whole line of them. I have them in 50%, 70%, and 100%. And they're like, oh, that wasn't hard. So I was like, I was just so impressed. I was like, now that is how we can change the world. Not only can we convert closures to HDPE, but we can convert them to PCR and really support that circular economy. So that is how I ended up with Westfall Technic, is through closures, and knowing that with our technologies, starting from design, like your point, we're designing the molds to support PCR, the different technical properties of PCR. Our hot runner system doesn't degrade the plastic as much. It's a much gentler system than what's traditionally on the market. So it actually supports recycling, for more years to come and more times you can recycle. And then being able to, produce the closures. So, those steps of the way we are planning for and designing for, to use the PCR in the product.
Wow. That's that almost never happens, right? when you ask for something new in packaging, it's a long lead development usually, right? So is this in the market yet? Is this commercially available?
Yeah. So Coca-Cola won an award for putting 30% PCR in their Dasani closures. So that was a very fun and exciting project to get to be part of, and having that come to be today in the market. So that is exciting. And so that's at 30%, but we certainly want to work with companies to push the envelope more and get that higher PCR content. So yes, it's in the market, but there is still so much more we can do.
Right. And so from a driver standpoint, who are the kind of the drivers that are changing this? Is it, the big companies? Is it the more natural brands? Who's driving this whole change?
Yeah, so in my experience, I always saw the natural brands being the leaders. They're at the tip of the spear, and they're out there pushing the boundaries, trying new things, being innovative, really trying to not accept the status quo, but push the boundaries. And I've seen a lot of the big companies acquiring these brands and then learning from them. So I think Unilever is a really interesting example with seventh generation. So usually, seventh generation, the little company gets bought by the really big company, and it's usually like, you conform to what we do. But I've really respected that they have let seventh generation really drive a lot of the packaging and being the ones that are being creative and innovative, and then taking those learnings to the broader group at Unilever. So I thought that was a really interesting model, and thought that worked really well to keep that sustainable packaging, like pushing the bigger company towards that.
Oh, wow. So how does design of the package, and I'm talking about design for consumers, right, but also technical design, how does that inform the sustainability questions?
Yeah, no, it all starts with design. I mean, you want, if you have to know what the goal is for the package. Obviously it's, to protect, the product inside, but then what's the end of life goal? And I think you need to ask that right at the beginning. So if you're going to have a package with, 14 different types of resin on it, and then you're going to throw some paper in it, and then you're going to put some black, if you're just going to have a million components, then you're not even thinking that. But if you're going to start from the beginning, thinking about sustainability, The Association of Plastics Recyclers has really good guidelines. And so I always recommend to companies to start with those guidelines, and that puts you on the right track to make your package recyclable. And I like to lean more towards designing for recyclability, because again, that's where the consumer gets to participate. So there's all these other different solutions for sustainable packaging. There could be compostable, biodegradable, bioresins. There's all sorts of different solutions, but to me, it really comes down to designing for recyclability and then having the consumer participate with you in that. So that's my bias, is that, designing for recyclability.
Yeah, so clearly the consumer, that's something actionable that the consumer can do, right? So they like to be able to take that package and be able to do something with it. However, the recycling rates in the United States are very low, right? We all know that.
So sad.
Right. So how can we engage the consumer a little bit more in this journey? Because clearly they don't see the process of designing the cap with, that might have 10 different parts on it of different kinds of plastic in it. How do we get them to engage in that whole process? Not only recycling, but just buying recycled packaging.
Yeah, that's, gosh, if I knew the answer to that question, I'd be probably the richest woman. How many years have we been trying to get consumers to recycle, and we're just still at these really dismal rates? And I'm kind of the go-to recycle person, and my friends are always, shooting me recycling questions and this and that. And to me, that just tells me it's just too difficult. It's just too tricky. There's too many different rules. I love to tell this story because it really exemplifies how tricky it is. I consider myself a recycling expert. I live it, I know it, I've worked in the industry. And when I was back living in Virginia in the DC area, I moved just a few blocks. I did not change. I was in the same city. I did not move jurisdictions. I just moved a few blocks. And I got into my new place, and I put all my recyclables out, and I was following all the rules. And then I get this letter in the mail accusing me of recycling wrong.
Oh my goodness.
And I'm like, do they know who I am? I am not recycling wrong. And then I read their list of grievances against me, and I was like, oh my gosh, they're right. I'm not doing, the rules completely changed when I moved neighborhoods, not even towns. I moved neighborhoods, and all the recycling rules changed. So one, I just think it's too gosh darn difficult for people to figure it out. And so I really think the future is, automation, robotics, having more automated recycling processes, and that, sad number of 30%, I think, we can get to much higher than that, with a more automated process.
Right. Clearly, the easier you make it for people to recycle, the better. So if we know that if you put a recycling bin right next to the trash bin, recycling goes up. But what about, and this is kind of pulling on your experience, what about legislation?
No, people don't like legislation, but everything I've seen is that it works. So anywhere where there is a bottle bill, deposits on certain containers, recycling is way higher than when there's not. There seems to be much higher participation in communities where there's fees implemented if you don't recycle. So you see more participation in that sort of situation. And then another example is way back in the late 90s, when California was implementing one of the first laws on requiring recycled content in, I think it was soda bottles, PET bottles. The industry's like, there's not enough recycled material out there. We'll never be able to meet these goals. It's impossible. And then quickly they were able to meet the demand, when there's a demand for it, it's amazing how you can find the feedstock for it. So they were able to not only meet the demand for that, but then have an excess. So as you know, as much as people don't like to go down that route, I've seen it be very effective.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for that insight that maybe so other people wouldn't have. What about going back to design? Have you worked with any designers to cut down on the amount of plastic, make a different kind of closure that maybe consumers aren't used to, but is more an elegant solution?
Yeah, absolutely. So one really good example, it's going to be hard to see because it's clear, but here is an example of a closure that was designed with HDPE. And if you go to any big company today and ask them if you can make a hinged closure with HDPE, and they'll tell you no. And
Right.
here is one right here. It's been tested. It can open and close hundreds of times. So here is a great example of a design that most people will tell you can't be done today. Here's even a second example of it. So here's another one with HDPE.
Wow. And is that PCR as well?
Nope. So these ones were just made with virgin, but that's exactly where we're going. Actually, I'm trialing some right now with hinged closures with 100% PCR. So I'll keep you posted on how that works. But really, it does come down to having a design and then the tooling that can go with that to make that work. And we work with Westfall Technic works with a company called Universal Closures. And they are very committed to converting any closure designs they have into HDPE so that we can keep driving that. It does two things. So converting to HDPE allows you in a lot of cases to match the resin on the container so that we eliminate that polypropylene contamination. And then two, there's a lot more feedstock of HDPE PCR than there is of polypropylene PCR. So if you want to be able to put PCR into a closure, if you can use HDPE, you'll have a lot more feedstock, a lot more consistent feedstock to be able to put into closure. So it's really that has those two benefits of matching the resin and then allowing a higher PCR content.
Wow. Well, a living hinge with HDPE is very exciting in the packaging industry. Yeah, if you've ever worked in the packaging industry, that's kind of like an exciting breakthrough thing. So that's great to see. That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, what can brands do to help this process? Because they're always looking for new things to do in sustainability, right? So we're talking packaging, we're talking closures. Obviously, they can try to look at their closures and try to get a package with monomaterial, the bottle and the cap to be the same thing. But what else can brands do in terms of sustainability from a packaging standpoint?
Yeah. So when you say brands are always trying to do something new, that scares me a little bit because new usually means like, oh, let's have something different and differentiated than everyone else. And when it comes to sustainable packaging, really having some consistency across the board is really helpful. So if you have 47,000 different kinds of packaging out there, it's really hard to get the critical mass to be able to have a good recycling program for that. So I really say, let's stick to the APR guidelines. Let's solve these problems first. Like you said, keeping that consistent resin, designing for recycling. These closures, to me, that was like the biggest area in the next phase is getting these closures converted. So those are the areas that I would focus on.
No, that's great. That's good that's good to hear because it's hard to hear things from inside the industry.
Really going back to like what is the goal for this package when you're done with it, and really understanding what that goal is. So my goal, I think, should always be that that you can recycle it.
So what is the biggest bottleneck in terms of limiting the sustainability of packaging? What is the thing that's keep holding us back right now, do you think?
So I think cost is always going to be a factor. It's expensive to make these changes. It's expensive to buy new tools and to convert your lines and do all the trials and testing. So I think that is something that brands, will need to commit to. So I would say that's probably the biggest, but change in general is always hard. Getting trust. You have to have those companies that are willing to take that leap of faith and to be the first and to go out there and put that in the market.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for talking to us, Sandra. I really appreciate it. I think you're one of the most interesting people in the industry. So thank you for talking to me.
Well, thank you.
Sandra works for Westfall Technic. For more information on Westfall Technic, you can go to their website at westfalltechnic.com. That's WESTFALLTECHNIK.com.